Please welcome the Honourable Lynch.
Thank you very much, Paul. It certainly doesn't seem like it was that many years ago. We spent all that time looking for the issue. And the same issue is are partially on your agenda now. I might just tell you, I come from Cape Breton. It's an anecdote to share with you. When I was appointed the 20th clerk of the Privy Council, Secretary of the Cabinet, in 2006, there was an article in one of our great national newspapers, the Cape Breton Post, talking about my appointment and noting that I was the clerk of the Privy Council when I was Secretary of the Cabinet. And I got this lovely note from a distant cousin in Cape Breton saying how much she and the family were proud of my appointment. But there was only two concerns she had. My dear departed mother would be very proud, but she'd be worried that the two jobs were going to my head, because I was being referred to as the clerk of the Privy Council and the Secretary of the Cabinet. Everybody in Cape Breton knew there were thousands of clerks and thousands of secretaries in Ottawa, but they were really proud I had two of those jobs. And I'll go. Anyway, great pleasure tonight to be here and invited to speak at the 2013 Life Science Ontario Gala. And it's an annual event that underscores both the importance of the sector to Ontario, and it is crucially important, and also as a chance to celebrate the achievements of leaders whose efforts in whether it's research, policy, innovation, and commerce have helped build the life sciences sector in our province. The organization Life Science Ontario, I think, is really Canadian. It's diverse in its stakeholders, it's collaborative in the way it does business, and it's purposeful in its advocacy for change. And it really is a model for others. What I want to talk to you tonight about is the profoundly changing world around us, around your sector, around all the sectors, and whether we're as ready as we should be to prosper in it. And I'll draw a little bit of this on the work that the Jobs and Prosperity Council did in its work for the Government of Ontario. And at the time of global uncertainty, and it really is quite a changing world, Ontario's calling card to the world is very impressive. A sound political and legal system, one of the best educated, most diverse workforces in the world, a competitive tax system, and an attractive business climate. Those are pretty impressive fundamentals in a hyper-competitive world economy. But, as we stressed in Advantage Ontario, talent is only valuable when it's productively deployed. A competitive tax system is only worth the investment it attracts. Strong research capacity only creates wealth and jobs when it is commercialized. And global opportunities only create jobs in Ontario when our firms take advantage of it. In other words, we've got the building blocks for success in Ontario. The challenge is that we have to build on them, not rest upon them, or we're going to lose ground. And one of our great concerns was the danger of complacency and the need to actually have a sense of urgency for change. Someone once noted the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of rocks. So that brings us to today's global reality. Anybody you would talk about how much the world is changing, and I could do it for hours and hours and hours. But just a couple little facts to note that how much the world is changing. Think about it. Kind of the world's tallest building today is in Dubai, not the United States. The world's largest shopping mall is in Beijing, not the United States. The world's largest motion picture industry is in Bollywood, not Hollywood. The world's largest trading company is Chinese, not American. And the world's richest man is Mexican, not American. The list would have been totally different 10 or 15 years back. And you can go on and on. The point of it is, I worry sometimes that we don't understand as well as we should and must those profound changes that are happening kind of in new areas of the world, and the importance of us taking our kind of capacity and reach out to them. I'll give you one quick little anecdote. I was in Dallas this year, and one of the sessions which had the president of Harvard, president of MIT, Bill Gates, and a couple of others, was about massively online courses. And it was an interesting discussion with kind of leaders of some of our great educational institutions kind of talking. And then at the end of it, the moderator, Tom Friedman, had one empty chair at the top, and he asked a young girl, from Pakistan, from Lahore, Khadija Niazi, to come up and sit down, introduced her. She was 12 years old. Asked her kind of what she had done. She'd never taken an online course. She replied that yes, The year before, she had taken the advanced physics course from Stanford online. Tom Friedman said, and how did you do? And she said, well, I passed it and I got the top marks. And asked, well, what did Stanford say? Well, they wrote me an email and asked me which graduate program I was in and which Pakistani university. And I told them I was 11 and I was just about to start middle school. And that's quite a different world than the one that I grew up in Cape Breton. So what are competitive economies going to look like over the balance? I mean, what is the new competitive norm? Because you have a lot of global companies here. Tom Friedman, again, at the same session, has a great line that in a hyper-connected world, the mantra of global corporations increasingly is imagine here, designed there, manufactured elsewhere, and sold everywhere. And how do we make sure in Ontario we have the imagining here, the designing here, the high-end manufacturing here, and the global kind of distribution originating from here? Because that corporation is going to behave that way. The key is how do we attract it to kind of fulfill those functions here in Ontario. And the last one is Nobel Prize winner Paul Krugman argues, and interesting, that productivity, quote, isn't everything, but in the long run, it is almost everything. In other words, if we're going to have the sort of standards of living and competitiveness that we want in Ontario industry for Ontario society, kind of are we focusing as much on productivity as it should be? And the question is, why productivity? Productivity is almost a P word that people are afraid to use in polite company. And it's not just a business issue, productivity. If we're not more productive, we can't pay higher wages. If we can't pay higher wages, we can't have more public goods, higher standards of living, better universities, better hospitals, better parks. So in a sense, it's as much a social issue as it is an economic issue. And why innovation? Because innovation is what drives productivity. And you see that in successful firms and countries around the world. In innovation, you know this in your sector, it's not about scale and cost. It's about creativity. It's the ability to produce new goods and services, to actually find or create kind of new markets, or to do kind of traditional things in new ways. In many ways, I think innovation is what helps answer the question of how a high-wage economy like Canada's can compete with the emerging economies. If we're not innovative, there's no way we can compete on cost and scale. In many ways, we don't want to compete on low wages. This has to be a high-wage economy. That's our aspirations for Ontario. So it has to be innovation. And what exactly is it? I like a saying that I again heard at Davos this year, quote, research is a process that transforms money into knowledge. And innovation is the process that transforms that knowledge back into money. And in Ontario, we have to be really good at both. So where does it leave us here in Ontario? And frankly, we are wedged somewhat uncomfortably between our traditional kind of approach to business of decades past and this new global reality, which is happening regardless of whether we're totally comfortable with it or not. Let me give you a couple of striking facts. Ontario's trade. So think about the world we're in. Kind of the economic center of gravity in the world is shifting back towards Asia. By the end of this decade, Asia will account for 50% of global GDP. It was in single digits in the 1950s. So with that rapidly changing world, Ontario's trade is 90% with the OECD, the slowest growing part of the world. And our trade with China, the fastest growing part of the world, is less than 1.5%. In other words, we are not in the growth parts of the trade market, and we have to think about it. Secondly, on business productivity, not total economy, but business. And Ontario's business is 75% of levels in the United States. Now, obviously, it doesn't apply to any firm in this room, but outside this building, our average productivity levels are much lower than they should be, and they're no longer subsidized by a low Canadian dollar. Third, and this is the sector, an issue you know well, business spending on R&D in Ontario is 1.2% of GDP. That's below the OECD average. It's half of the United States. It's 1/4 of Israel. And again, as everyone of you know, innovation is the lifeblood of the sector that actually you're in. And lastly, is we spend incredibly less than many of our competitors on advanced machinery and ICT. So therein actually is our collective challenge. We're a very sophisticated economy in this province. We've got an extremely well-educated workforce. We have a high standard of living, we have extraordinary institutions and great civic values. We're a high-wage economy, but we're a chronic underperformer in innovation and productivity. And essentially, we either are going to have to increase our productivity and innovation, or we're actually going to have strains on our standard of living. We can't have a high standard of living and underperformance than the others. In short, what we really have to do is diversify. We have to be in new markets, we have to be dealing with new consumers, and we have to be in new products and services. And kind of where should we start? How do we get there? This is what we talked about in the Advantage Ontario report. I mean, first is getting the macroeconomic context right. It's absolutely necessary. It means that as a country, as a province, we've got to have low levels of debt, low corporate tax rates, high public investment rates in university research, a well-educated workforce, a sound financial system, and strong institutions. But we do. So clearly, while necessary, they're not sufficient for the economic renewal that we're going to have in Ontario. So we have to figure out how do we actually go above and beyond that to produce the productive and entrepreneurial and innovative business climate that we need. Now, part of what's missing, I think, is finding the right balance between pressure for change and the support to change. We've got lots of supports to change. We may not have as much pressure for change. Competition and exposure to foreign markets create enormous pressure, but they also bring out creativity. There's an oft-cited observation that, quote, most people don't change because they see the light. They change because they feel the heat. And the issue in Canada is, are we feeling as much heat as we really need to feel? Simply put, the facts suggest that there's probably not enough competitive pressure in the Canadian economy, including here. And what that means is, although simultaneously we have some of the most innovative, productive, entrepreneurial, global market-seeking firms anywhere, they're not our average. And our average performance is so much less than our best, and that's a bit of a challenge. So what I think we need is finding a better alignment of interests. In many ways, we need an ecosystem, an innovation ecosystem in Ontario that really actually pulls together the strengths that we have. It actually gives players like you something to better coalesce around. A little bit some of the things that Paul and I used to talk about in the mid-90s, about how we create a Canadian approach to research and development, how property rights, intellectual property research, how you have to get them all right and knit it together. One on their own is not going to do it. So I'll give you a brief little frame. I'll tie in some of our thinking from the council as well. I would argue 4 parts to the frame. First is the macroeconomic innovation environment, and that's governance. And that's setting the rules of the game, and I went through those things, and we do pretty well in Ontario and federal. But governments also have to be part of the productivity innovation. They account for 35% of gross domestic product in Canada. So it's not enough that they actually set the rules of the game well, and I think we do well in Canada and Ontario, frankly, but they actually have to be part of it. And in the Jobs and Prosperity Council report, we recommended, for example, that Ontario has 50-odd business support programs. 50-odd ones. We actually have one problem in Ontario. We have to be more innovative. Why do we have 50 programs? So our suggestion, have one fund, have clear access criteria, going global, being more productive, being more innovative, to make it easier and clearer for Ontario firms to access it and know the basis of it. We also suggested that there be a shift towards strategic innovation procurement. And away from the risk aversion of current system, think about most government procurement, whether it's federal or provincial. The first weighted question is, how long has your company been in business? And secondly, how long has the product been on the market? So if you've had a company that's been around for 100 years with a product that's kind of been on the market for 20 years, you've actually you're ahead in selling that. That is, in many ways, kind of discriminates against innovation and the chance for new startups. And so we've got to think, if we want to encourage innovation in this province, we've got to make sure that our own programs are consistent with it. Last one is that we suggested in terms of Ontario small and medium-sized enterprise. You know, today, as global as the world is, as business like as this province is, fewer than 7% of Ontario firms shipped a single good or sold a single service outside of Canada last year. How are we going to win in this emerging economy unless we're part of it? In fact, we've got to be better at doing that than our neighbors to the south and our competitors in the UK. So one of the things we suggested was, Rather than the traditional trade mission, where kind of premiers and prime ministers take 30 or 40 companies with them, kind of to China or elsewhere, which, given that there are 900,000 companies in Ontario, it would take about 300 years to introduce all of you to that emerging market. Why don't we do large-scale reverse trade missions, where we actually bring Sector X in China to Toronto, and actually engage 3,000, 4,000 of our business people with the potential there and build partnerships. We've got to think differently about achieving the objective. The second area is the micro-innovation environment. That's essentially our community colleges, our school system, and our universities. And we have great infrastructure here in Ontario. Part of what we were talking about in the council was that we've got to shift the dialogue, in the university and community college system towards the potential benefits, what they mean for the business community, how it can help us grow and create jobs, how your kids' future and grandkids' future is going to be shaped by the ability to take not just do good research, but actually commercialize that research. And today, I think we're doing much better research than we are at commercialization of it. And we're missing that commercialization gap. It's missing the virtuous circle where research kind of leads a cycle of leading to innovation, which leads to wealth and job creation, and that in turn creates resources to kind of reinvest in the research. And you have a gap in that, which we do, that actually makes it more difficult. Third area is the community innovation infrastructure. And I think this is the modern version of industrial policy. It's not picking winning firms, but I think it's actually taking some chances on the sectors and the technologies and the geographies of the future that are going to matter. And that requires a collective approach. It's not a government bureaucrat or a minister that's going to do it, although they can very much convene folks to do it. It's one that we have to do ourselves. And I think that's crucial, because it's what brings together finances, mentorship, and all those sorts of things. I think we've got two great examples in Ontario, Mars here in Toronto, and Keynote. But the issue is we need many more and at a larger scale to achieve what we want. And part of Advantage Canada, or Advantage Ontario, talked about building on these and actually forming a collective view of the business community about the targeted sectors where we can win. Where can Ontario win? Think about it. Dominic Barton's, the Canadian head of McKinsey Global, talks about China is not just a superpower that buys our energy and buys our natural resources. In India, China, Indonesia, there's somewhere now between 600 to 900 million consumers, middle-class consumers. They didn't exist a decade ago. They're going to buy things like housing, education, financial services, value-added food stuff, life science products, healthcare, all the stuff that we are so good at producing in the North American context. We've got to think about those new consumers and make sure we work kind of at it. The last area that we mentioned in the same one is the importance of diversity. We've got to actually make sure that we introduce entrepreneurship, not just to our business schools, but actually throughout our university and our high school system. And immigration plays such a crucial role. We've got to make sure that we attract the best and the brightest to Ontario and integrate them and make them successful here, which is great for themselves and their families and great for us. I'll give you a factoid. 25% of every high-tech startup in the United States in the last decade, one of the founders was foreign-born. So this is an extraordinary source of innovation, creativity, and growth in our economy if we can tap it. The last area that I mentioned is business innovation infrastructure. Frankly, we don't spend enough money in business on innovation. And then, it's not governments that create and sell goods and services. It's the private sector. And that's what they're designed to do. And we've got to basically look to them to do a better job at it. They've got to organize for innovation, they've got to manage innovation, they've got to create the incentives for innovation, and they have to invest in it. The last point I make is the time frame matters. Right? One of our great challenges is that, in fact, we forget that the early mover advantage in an innovative thing. If you're in the pharmaceutical area, if you don't get that new drug out before your competitors, it's not a very happy outcome. That's the same is true now for companies and countries. And I think that we don't think about the time frame enough. That we're sometimes confused heading in the right direction, which we unambiguously are, with the speed at which we're going in that direction. Early mover advantages matter hugely. And they matter particularly in a world where the new wealth of nations is talent and ideas. And we have that potential, both of those things, to be a winner. I would argue, very much picking up, I think, the article by the Governor General several weeks back, that Canada and Ontario have to be more ambitious. I think we should aim to lead a few technology trends, not follow. The new industrial policy is creative ideas. I think we have to aim to win the Nobel Prizes. It's validation of our researchers' ability, but also inspiration to our citizens and government. We've got to become first-class innovators of research. We've got to be the ones who turn knowledge into money. We've got to build a world-class talent pool through education and immigration. And it's the two things. In a demographically challenged world, it's those two things that are going to make a difference. And lastly, I think we've got to brand Ontario and Canada as entrepreneurial and innovative. Right now, our brand is we're nice. We are, but I'm not sure that's enough. So, if you think about all this, kind of where does it take us? Today, the drivers of competitiveness for shutdown, I just talked about that. Innovation was at the center of the conversations in Davos this year. And it's interesting, again, as the Canadians and Ontarians listening to these conversations, because the two things they focused on most were attitude, a sense of urgency, a fear of complacency, and the second was leadership. The need to create this kind of sense at both the corporate level if you're a business CEO, or at the provincial or national level if you're a political leader, that actually we have to kind of embrace change. We have to get ahead of change. We can't fear change. We have to, in many ways, invest now in innovation and disruptive innovation. Others are going to do the incremental stuff. Why aren't we doing the disruptive stuff? Why aren't we defining new industries, creating kind of that kind of here in Ontario? Two themes. The dominant theme was that leaders become too risk-averse in uncertain times and avoid innovation just when it can have the highest payback. I was listening to a panel where the chairman of Samsung from South Korea was there, and he said, look, my message to my management team these days, my entire workforce is, the world is so uncertain, you should change everything except your spouse and your kids. And we should, I think, embrace change. A related theme was the tyranny of short-termism, that we're not investing for the long term. We're investing in the short term, but the overriding theme was the role of leadership. And leadership matters all the time, but I would argue it matters profoundly at a time of a changing kind of world. Because that's when you really see the differentiation between leadership and managership. And reflecting on the nature and power of leadership, Teddy Sorensen was one of the speechwriters for President Kennedy, once wrote, quote, "Those who wish to stand up and stand out and leave something enduring behind must build new institutions, not new images. They must look to the next generation, not merely the next election. They must talk in terms of fundamental values, not merely cost. They must appeal to our hopes as well as our needs, to what we long to be and what we know is right." That's leadership. And I think how right he was, and we need that leadership today from all segments of our economy and our society, because we have so much potential here in Ontario. Thank you very much.